Welcome to PS. PS is Ploughshares' tribute to our literary histories, an addendum to the print issues. PS presents contemporary dialogues in the epistolary tradition, love letters that revisit, remix, and reimagine our literary past, present, and future. Here you'll find essays, interviews, recordings, and other multimedia ephemera in direct conversation with Ploughshares' 50-plus year archive. I'm Kathryn Nuernberger, author of 3 lyric essay collections and 4 poetry collections. My latest book is Held, Essays in Belonging. When Jenny Molberg, the editor of Ploughshares, invited me to create a love letter for this PS series, I started at the beginning of the Ploughshares archive and read my way forward. This, of course, is a fascinating way to get a snapshot of a particular corner of a literary landscape at a particular moment in history. And many things struck me. The overwhelming whiteness, the overwhelming maleness of the tables of contents can't really be understated. And I did not love that. So this is not a love letter to that. But I was struck by the unfamiliarity of the creative nonfiction sections of these tables of contents. During the 70s and the 80s, the nonfiction work in the magazine was mostly just book reviews with the occasional inclusion of something called poets' journals. And I recall reading a few poets' journals that came out in the 90s and early 2000s. Charles Simics's stands out in my mind. But this genre seems to have fallen away in more recent decades. Or I was wondering if maybe we just call it something else now. In the Ploughshares issues from the 80s and 90s, even when the nonfiction pieces weren't being described as journals and they had titles as we think of essays having, they still always had the same kind of segmented, private, informal, and lyrical quality that I'd been seeing in those poets' journals. And they were usually written by people primarily known as poets. And it reminded me of a few things. One, how very new creative nonfiction is as a literary genre. There's, of course, been journalism for a very long time, but that's not something you would publish in a literary magazine. Memoir and autobiography as a literary form are relatively nascent, I think. And even the personal essay, which is at least as old as Montaigne, has only recently become a fairly popular literary form. I think I know these things, but I found myself wondering what experts on the history of literary nonfiction might have to say about these works of nonfiction and their context. So I'm very happy to be in conversation with you, Heidi Czerwiec, and you, Lee Horikoshi Roripaugh, to talk about a few essays from the Ploughshares archive. I'm anticipating our conversation together will become a kind of love letter to the lyric essay and a remix of the story of how creative nonfiction emerges as a genre. And you are the perfect people for this conversation. I will tell our listeners why. Heidi Czerwiec writes essays and poetry and every hybrid in between. She's the author of Crafting the Lyric Essay, Strike a Chord, and an editor of Essay, a journal of nonfiction studies. Her other books include Fluid States, a lyric essay collection, and the poetry collection Self-Portrait as Betty Page. With Lee Horikoshi Roripaugh, she is the editor of the Rose Medal Press Field Guide to Writing the Lyric Essay, which is coming soon. Lee Horikoshi Roripaugh is a biracial Nisei author and the author of 5 volumes of poetry, most recently Tsunami versus the Fukushima 50, which was named a Best Book of 2019 by the New York Public Library and listed as a poetry finalist in the 2020 Lambda Literary Awards. Her book of lyric essays, Unmothered, Untongued, winner of the Sue William Silverman Prize for Creative Nonfiction in the 2024 AWP Award Series, was published by University of Georgia Press this past September. Their fiction collection, Revealed Codes, winner of the Moon City Press Short Fiction Award, was published by Moon City Press in 2023. And her chapbook, #String of Beads, a winner of the Diode chapbook competition, was published by Diode Press in 2023. Horikoshi Roripaugh received the Association of Asian American Studies Book Award in Poetry and Prose for 2004 and was a 1998 winner of the National Poetry Series. 7 of their essays have been listed as notable essays in Best American Essays. So let's dive in. I was hoping we could start with sort of an overview question based on the 3 pieces from the Ploughshares archive we'll focus on in this conversation. Maxine Kumin's Estivating Journal, Annie Dillard's 4 Bits, and Toi Derricotte's Blacks at the U. And all of these will be available for people listening to this to read in their entirety on the PS blog. So Heidi and Lee, I'm wondering, can you talk about how you understand the genre of poets' journal to fit into the story of the emergence of literary nonfiction, and especially this thing we are lately calling the lyric essay?
I was particularly struck by the ways in which they felt almost in dialogue with the Heian Japanese women's tradition of uh, writing poetic diaries or journals, or say Shonagun's Pillow Book, which is, such an early example of poetic prose that I think creates a possible lineage for what the lyric essay is or what the lyric essay can do. But I think that also thinking about this question of journal, it got me to thinking about the question between, public writing and private writing, and something about the interiority, the questions of subjectivity, which I think we sometimes feel occurs more in the realm of poetry, but seeing them in this sort of diary or journal format really felt to me like it was sliding in that kind of hybrid space of lyric essay as well. Something that does, I think, really focus on some of the interiority, on those sort of more small, nuanced, quiet questions of subjectivity that we see addressed in poems, but here in kind of an essay format. So I felt it did feel very familiar to me, and really felt very close to like my own impulses as a lyric essayist.
I'm so glad you brought up Saishonokon. I knew that that would just be like the perfect entryway for you, and especially in thinking about like how much she predates Montaigne in her writings
Yes.
too. Um, and yeah, I think that there's also a tradition with what came to my mind was John Donne's, I'm going to get the title wrong. I want to say it's called Meditations on Emergent Occasions. I'm not sure, but the writings that he was doing as he was dying, probably of cancer, but he, pretty much each day was writing these little moments where he is sort of thinking about dying and what that means. And um, while they're in prose, they have that very lyric sensibility, and they give us a lot of the um, well-known phrases like "No man is an island" or "Ask not for whom the bell tolls; it tolls for thee." Like those came from those writings. Um, and I like what you were saying, Lee, about the interiority, that it seems like these poets' journals and the examples that Kate gave us to read, um, and the ones that we've mentioned all have that, instead of a journal being the narrative account of like this happened and then this happened and then this happened, of having these lyric moments that are sort of that interiority, like these lyric moments that get inhabited and then just sort of juxtaposed next to each other, going from moment to moment, and then letting them steep and letting letting them sort of move laterally by accumulation rather than by succession, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, Kate, I would also love to hear you talk some about this because I know so much of your practice has been an almost journal-like daily engaging with, plants that were used as abortifacients or accounts of execution of people as witches and taking one each day and writing on it. If you don't mind talking about that.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's funny because I do journal every day, right? And everything begins as a journal because it's like my trick for taking the pressure off. Like I don't actually have to write anything except a page of like blah blah blah. And then I fill a notebook and then I come back later and like excavate it for poems or for essays or for, just whatever. Um, but like a lot of times I can't think of what to say, so I'll do research. So there'll be lots of pages of research, and sort of the paradox of like my work being personal sometimes is that that's actually the part I often am adding later. Is like I get obsessed by something I'm researching, and I'm just like writing down tons of facts in my notebook, and I think they're so interesting, and then I have to later realize like bring in something from what was happening in my life to help readers be in the same like emotional space with me. So I'm sort of contrary, like right, like I like the work is an illusion. It feels like a diaristic, but that's actually like a layer. The actual diary is actually like a Wikipedia article. Um, but I have been thinking, like, yeah, well, there's other questions later about time, but like right now, so today is January 13th that we're recording this. The podcast element will probably roll out in a month from now. So who knows what the future will be like, except I think we can predict it will probably feel as chaotic and inexplicable as it does now. But Heidi and I are in the Twin Cities, and there's ice everywhere. And yeah, I just feel like it's very difficult for me right now to make sense of what's happening. So I just keep writing, like almost like Heather Cox Richardson, who's the historian that like writes every day, this is the date, and she kind of just lists what's happening. And I've found that very grounding, just to be like, yes, thank you for this list of like just like helping me articulate what is actually happening, because what is happening feels hard to make sense of in a story because it's intentionally like chaotic, right? Like there's like a blitz of total mayhem and cruelty all the time, and it's meant to be destabilizing. So I have been appreciating the way the journal feels like it has a capacity to just like be grounding in the sense of these are the things that I know are true. And I really appreciate the Heather Cox Richardson sort of style of doing it in like, here are the facts we know to be true today. And I've also been feeling in a poetic way of just being like, and also this is what's happening out my window. This is what it feels like to walk through my neighborhood today, which my neighborhood today is full of ICE agents. So it feels scary to walk through my neighborhood today. My neighborhood is full of really brave people with whistles today. And that feels beautiful and also still really terrifying. I'm a little bit off topic here in a very big way, but I've just been thinking about but I have been thinking about like, what can the art of the journal do to make it a totally intentionally disorienting and like ungrounding situation, be grounded, and appreciating that that's something art does for us. Let's go back to the essays. Let me bring it back to the book. Let's see. Maxine Kumin writes near the beginning of her essay, which she calls Estivating (parentheses Journal), which appears in issue 5 in spring of 1974. I was thinking about this one a lot too, because I was like, she talks about the headlines and the hearings, and I was like, oh, I think I know which hearings. So I was double checking that it was in fact the Watergate hearings that she's writing about, being on a horse farm in the middle of the Watergate hearings. So she writes, she's got this lovely passage where she writes, things tie themselves together with little quote marks, and perhaps the string cross hatches itself into a statement in time. Who knows? My son, scanning the New York Times one weekday morning when it was heavy with financial articles of the technical sort, complained, not even anybody good died today. And I hang on to that phrase as it reflects the kind of stasis I'm in, estivating here. And I love this word estivating, which I'm not ashamed to admit, I had to look it up. And it refers to the arrangement of flowers, petals, and sepals when closed in bud. There's a word for that. Or the torpor an animal enters during a hot or dry period. And I wondered about the ways lyricism in poetry and lyric essays, which sort of sidestep the thrust of a narrative arc, how do they elevate and embrace estivation as this sort of germinal mode of being for art?
I think a lot about this, and I think it ties back to what I was saying a moment ago about the poets' journals not being that narrative succession, that estivating with having the petals and sepals like overlapping as they're closed in the bud, that it's more moving in a spiral, if that makes sense. So that lateral moving, where instead of moving straight forward by succession or chronology, instead putting ideas or images or thoughts side by side by side and kind of letting them spiral around. And so it does advance, the sepals and the petals don't come into a circle, that they do spiral. So there is an advancement, but it's more like by juxtaposition, by accumulation, by how they layer on top of each other, rather than moving straight forward. So it has that almost like a labyrinth type movement to it. it also made me think, and Lee, you might agree with this, in the Rose Metal Press project that we're working on, Torrin Greathouse has a piece in that where she's been adapting Alice Fulton's fractal poetics to lyric essays. And so talking about using fractals and thinking about like the spiral in nature and how they're overlapping like that as well. Yeah, just seeing those layers. And I also love the suggestion where you're talking about the torpor of both those buds or all of the petals overlapped in the bud and the torpor of an animal as having a suggestion of like biding one's time or having sort of a slow build or a slow wait that doesn't necessarily tell you right away what it's about. So it has that unfolding, that biding your time before it reveals everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I also thinking about Natanya and Polly's
Mm.
beautiful essay on the spiral as kind of a structure by which she's shaping her lyric essays. But I do love the whole idea of estivation in both of its meanings because I increasingly have come more and more to distrust conventional linear narrative because there's something about it that feels so predetermined that kind of, forces, climaxes, and closures that don't seem to me to really be in alignment with the chaos and complexity of not only this contemporary cultural moment, but our lives as we're trying to navigate, the scariness and chaos of this contemporary moment. But when I think about, the arrangement of petals or the question of torpor, the idea of trusting in the process so the meaning making arises organically or the patterns start to manifest in kind of an organic shape or way and kind of lift to the surface and make themselves felt or apparent. That seems to be something that feels characteristic of what I might suggest as a lyric structure or a lyric process of meaning making, the way in which the poet, will let something kind of marinate as opposed to this happened and then this happened and then there was a big explosion in the end. So
I love that. I love that. The organic, yeah. I think that's a really good way of tying that in.
Yeah, I'm always really bumming out my students who want to write long form narrative memoirs in a sort of like novelistic fashion. Well, I mean, bumming them, like I'm like trying to be helpful because I try to be a good advisor, but I'm always like, I'm just super skeptical of this because it requires believing everything happens for a reason, right? If the chronology of your life is going to line up with your capacity to make sense of things too,
yeah.
and like build this like kind of coherent narrative arc, just structurally that the chronological memoir structurally to me seems like it has a pretty tough baked in problem with also seeming true.
Yeah.
Just because it feels like life is a mess and then you make sense of it later. Uh, but
And it's so strange when you're talking about nonfiction, which seems to
Yeah.
have like this truth or verity to it that, yeah, it doesn't quite seem honest or it seems artificial to impose that neat narrative arc on life that way with the memoir.
Yeah. And it seems very controlling too, which sort of feels like an imposition of power, as well as an imposition of structures that, are inherently, white, patriarchal, ableist, cishet.
um, so one
Instead
of the
of
things that
notice, I'm sorry, go
no no
ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, just instead of like when you think about with with the lyrical too, instead of letting the patterns pull from the material itself. So where you're noticing repetitions, things spiraling on themselves, repeating, that seems to be like more where you're finding the meaning is in the repetitions and in how those lyric moments pile up rather than in like imposing a structure from the outside.
So makes me think maybe we can, what you're saying aligns, I think, a little bit with some questions I had about Toi Derricotte's essay, Blacks in the U, which appears in the spring 1996 issue. I just want to give people some context for it before we dive into talking about it. So it's one of the first times we see Ploughshares publish a work of creative nonfiction that's not a poet's journal. It's presented just as an essay in the way we might think of essays. That's one thing that's notable about this issue. Lots about this issue are notable. Marilyn Hacker was the guest editor, and the issue features greater diversity than any of the previous Ploughshares issues. She highlights lots of major voices who are still really influential today. So just spring 1996 was a good year, I think, for Ploughshares, and Marilyn Hacker was a really good editor for them. There are two nonfiction pieces in this issue. One of them is by Toi Derricotte, and in keeping with this Ploughshares trend, the authors are both poets. Adrian C. Lewis is the other. They both use a segmented style that piece together stories and ideas through these like sensory impressions, snippets of scenes. And in Toi Derricotte's essay, she writes about colorism and about being one of the only or one of very few Black women in a university where her colleagues say she looks white, which I imagine is, well, yeah, it just seems shitty. And she is the sort of occasion of the essay, she's describing another Black woman being hired who her colleagues tell her also looks white. So much bad, uncomfortable kinds of discourse happening in this setting. So the essay chronicles Derricotte's anxieties before, during, and after meeting this other Black woman for the first time. And in this essay, she tries, I think, with honesty and vulnerability to unpack the loneliness and fears of her positions, as well as internalized racism. She notes the ways this kind of dynamic creates just so many fucked up layers on top of every interaction she's having, including and most especially with this woman who's just been hired. And in lyric fashion, the essay is spiraling in unexpected directions towards complex relationships with her mother, trying to be the person someone else needs or wants her to be. It culminates in a confession of fear that feels kind of like an attempt, at least in my reading, to exorcise it and imagine some like more honest and genuine pathway to connection. The shortest segment of the essay, which comes right near the end, she writes just these sentences. She says, race isn't a metaphor. Color isn't a metaphor. It doesn't feel like a metaphor. It hurts as if it's my skin. I feel sick. I hate myself. I make you hate me. I separate. I come back. Forgive me. This is the best I can do. So I was curious to hear you both talk about how you might situate this essay in a tradition of poets writing essays, because Toi Derricotte, I think I know her most and best as a poet. I think a lot of people do. I'm curious, how does lyricism serve her here? But also, how does a prosy directness also operate in a piece where the writer is directly addressing so many fraught subjects? I'll say I was thinking about how lyrical fragmentation can feel risky when you're writing about a fraught subject like race, because maybe like you don't want to let go of the reader's hand as you're sort of walking them through your thinking because you don't want to risk misunderstanding. And then I was thinking, on the other hand, there's this way a lyric leap can be a relief when you're working with fraught material, because sometimes there's these feelings and experiences that are maybe best granted a bit of ineffable space, like a moment where the writer and reader just sit together in a contemplative silence. I think both of these kinds of moves are happening in this essay. So for you all, I'm curious to hear, how do this essay's ways of navigating its subjects, are they similar, different from other lyric essays you've seen in works you've loved, moves you've done in your own work?
I think it's such a fantastic essay, and for me, I feel like it foreshadowed moves and essays that I love, like Gita Kathari's "If You Are What You Eat, Then What Am I," which kind of looks at, immigrant culinary experiences, food as a kind of cultural literacy signifier of community and belonging, food as obligatory assimilation. I also felt it really adumbrated or foreshadowed the incredible work Claudia Rankine did in Citizen, with these short, tight vignettes of small moments, like microaggressions, yet when you look at those small uh, instances and the ways in which they cumulatively pile up, or you look at that small moment and see the ways in which it kind of unfolds into revelations of structures of white supremacy in really powerful ways, that you understand how deeply it's embedded and how insidiously it's embedded. I feel like those are both kind of, segmented or fragmented works that are creating then the space through association for the reader to kind of feel those feelings for themselves, and also begin to connect those dots for themselves, which means like maybe it's a kind of learning then that is more powerful because the reader's arriving at those conclusions on their own. At the same time, the kind of very direct statements create that sort of interiority or, subjectivity. So it's not this kind of expository study on these questions of race or immigration or belonging or microaggression. There's skin in the game, to maybe kind of come back to the quote that you read from Toi Derricotte.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I'm glad that you brought up Claudia Rankine. It does seem like um, the fragmentation and the spaces do operate in a way that kind of lets it exist between poetry and prose, and the prose gives the reader a sort of lulling sense of like, oh, this is prose, like this isn't scary, and lets it work under the radar to do all of that lyric work, but also leaving those spaces for the reader to um, make those connections between, what happened in the office, her mother, like you were saying, all those different moments. Um, that made me think of Dinty Moore's essay, Positively Negative, that's in Nicole Walker and Margot Singer's Bending Genre, that where he is talking about noticing it, like that was one of the early works that was trying to talk about what is the white space doing in creative nonfiction. And he raised the same thing you said, Lee, about that it invites the reader in to participate, much in the way that poetry often demands more of a reader than prose often does, but that it allows the reader to engage, um, and make those connections for themselves in a way that can feel a lot more authentic and organic when they reach that for themselves. Um, Also made me think a bit of the cognitive theorist Roy Vanseur, who wrote a lot about figurative language. And since the passage that you read talked about metaphor, but sort of the same thing, that letting the reader make that connection for themselves is very powerful. And like when they understand what the figurative language is doing and makes that connection, and then also, like we were saying with white space, makes that connection, that can feel so much more powerful. But then adding on to what you were saying about Claudia Rankine's work, that one thing that I've noticed in her work, and that positively or possibly is happening in Toys as well, is the idea of using white space in Black writing to represent the white spaces in which these authors are writing, and trying to occupy with their words too, that I don't think can be entirely discounted either. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
but
the moment, oh, I'm sorry.
no, no, no,
The mo
please.
Okay, when the when she says race is not a metaphor, that is such an incredibly powerful articulation. And I to me it also feels like an unwillingness to aestheticize something as complex as race. I think that she's not willing to create a vehicle to illuminate someone's tenor of race so that they can feel good for having read about race, but also that she's not willing to aestheticize it or lyricize it in maybe some of the more traditional modes of lyricism, such as figurative language, and the idea that that kind of also perhaps transforms it into beautiful language in a way that allows the reader to feel comfortable from that reading experience. And there's something so incredible about that moment, I think.
Yeah, and perhaps with having the reader do the work that goes to like a whole other level when you're talking about work by marginalized
Mhm.
writers as well, to like, no, you need to do the work. I'm not going to do all the work for
Yeah.
you. Like you need to make those connections.
Well, I was thinking we could jump to talking about Annie Dillard, who is certainly not, I would say, not a marginalized writer, at least not in the same ways, or we know her well, but she is using Jex. Although we know her as an essayist, I think maybe she's less known as a poet. And we're also in the tank now for poet essayists in this moment of this conversation. I was thinking though, when you all were talking about resisting the way Toi Derricotte's essay is resisting certain kinds of lyricism, I was thinking about the role of the juxtaposition in those segmented essays, and that the way the essay just keeps abruptly kind of shifting gears pressurizes the experience of reading it. And Four Bits, I think, is using that kind of like pressurized juxtaposition where we have like the piece is called Four Bits, and it really, like, I read it over and over again, being like trying to think about how these four bits are fitting together. And that part of I think the fascination and the thing keeps pulling me in is that they mostly don't, or the fact that they don't feels like important. So I'll start by giving just a little passage from Four Bits. So she writes in this piece, these times are points on, she's writing about certain kinds of sensory experiences or moments. These times are points on which a great many pressures bear down. The mind returns to them. Their meaning is never resolved. They are doors banging on their hinges, disturbing the peace. But the feeling of such times and the fact that life produces them are not private, but universal. This feeling and fact are the very stuff of the novel, Ship of Fools, The Magic Mountain, the key scenes of 100 modern novels. They are one of literature's few subjects. There is, after all, time, eternity, and nothing else. And time, like light, is both particle and wave. I was thinking about how the form of the fragmented journal, one held loosely together by themes or impressions, is maybe able to operate as like both a particle and a wave. I think we see that in Kumin's journal. There's this like wave of a season she's spending on a farm, and then the particles of a moment, like she's counting nematodes in a pile after deworming the horses. She's got some really exquisite descriptions of gathering mushrooms. And then in this Four Bits essay, there are like four particles, I would say, or moments in time in this essay. So in these pieces, I feel Annie Dillard sort of resisting the wave. Her work as a writer seems to be, as she perceives it, to like stay with those particles as closely as she can. And maybe she needs to stay with them because she seems really inclined towards like flights of totally transcendent fancy. And so she maybe has to stay with the moments as much as she can bear to, or else she'll be like off. So let's see. So she's looking so closely at the world around her, and then there's this kind of crescendo of looking that like overwhelms her, and it's like we pass through the eye of a needle into some kind of a divine hurricane. And so then she's got lines like, you try to love the forest now where you are, but you cannot. You no longer believe in it. It's no longer a forest, but the fringe of the real. It is illusion, and its life a lie. Its soil gives way to sand. Your heart is cracking. The light breaks where the forest halts at the rim of the shore, the sea, the long, clean beach, the holy God, almighty sky. I'm supposed to ask you a question. I'm just sort of like actually using this as an occasion to like read you some nice lines of Annie Dillard. So to get to the point, in one of the four bits, she's describing overheard snippets of conversation in train stations. And another, she describes a walk through the forest to the sea. In a third, she's describing nude models in a life drawing class where she felt very restless and keeps walking around the room. And then in the fourth, she describes her restlessness again in a hospital where she describes herself as going AWOL and goes out and just walks on a wall in the parking lot while she's waiting for some EKG results. And I guess what I'm wondering is, what do you think she's trying to offer us, or what is she trying to achieve with these juxtapositions, or maybe just more broadly, like what's up with poet essayists doing juxtapositions?
I mean, yeah, that's a really interesting question too. Like, how are we supposed to consider these four bits together? Like, were they intentionally grouped together? I mean, obviously they were if they were published together, but like, did she just randomly pick four and like, okay, here's four things? Or were they crafted to be put beside each other to add up to a whole beyond its parts? Like, it's an interesting question. And it seems like in these pieces, it's forcing you to do that work and seem to be about like comfort versus new perspectives, like seeking out new perspectives. Um, yeah, which for her then I think lead to ecstatic moments that with ecstatic meaning like literally outside the self, that by forcing these new perspectives that, even at that one moment, she hears the perspective of the doctor perceiving her through a window who thought, oh, that can't be Annie Dillard. Like, no, that's a man. And so, like, being so far outside herself that she's completely misidentified. Um, yeah, what is up with
That's a
poetry
boy, I think is what he said
juxtaposition?
to me. Not that's a man, that's a boy.
That's a boy. Okay.
Which I was like trying to read it. I was like, is he misinterpreting her? Like is he misgendering her, or is he looking at a man because she is out there, or a boy because she's out there doing this very boyish thing of like walking on the park around the parking lot on like a wall kicking rocks, which feels very Annie Dillardish. Or I was like, I wondered if he was like saying like attaboy, like if that was a way attaboy was getting said, where it was like appreciating Annie Dillard in that moment. Anyway, um, I was trying to decide which way to read it.
No, that's a good point. But yeah, I think with how what's up with all the juxtaposition, like
Yeah,
you were
it's hard.
saying that um I don't know if I'm trying to claim something for the lyric approach for this lateral movement and juxtaposition, but I'm not trying to claim it with that phrase that F. Scott Fitzgerald said about like true intelligence being about holding two opposing ideas at the same time. And so there is a certain intelligence to it of being able to put these things side by side and see connections between them. Um, yeah, I'm not sure
I
what.
see it as kind of, yeah, for me, those large juxtapositions are about seeing metaphor or patterning kind of writ large, so that it's, not just at the level of the sentence, but then at the level of the piece. So what are the patterns that are being presented to me or emerging? And what are sort of maybe those larger extended metaphors, perhaps, that I can take away? So for me, juxtaposition does feel very lyric. And one of the things I've always loved about Dillard is I can read Dillard, in the way that I read poetry, which has a lot to do, I think, with making those connections or making those sort of larger sorts of metaphors. And then the way that the very particular can become universal, or the way the personal can become political. And for me, I guess in four bits, so that whole notion of the particle versus the wave. So what to be a person having this very particular personal experience, but then the ways in which that becomes about a person in context with different people or larger kinds of communal or sort of cultural movements, and what does that mean? So that becomes a kind of travel from, the interiority to the self to an awareness of the self in context with other people, or being like misrecognized, and what that does for sort of the interior experience of the self. Oh, it's a boy, or so that kind of travel between sort of particle and wave, and sort of the individual resistance to want to be a particle, but then always sort of being reminded of being somebody who's subject to those larger contexts, whether one wants to or not, that you're moving through those larger spheres.
It has me thinking about that conversation we were having earlier about the honesty of
Yes.
lyricism in
Yes.
its way, right? And the achronicity of lyricism too, which is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that to me the juxtapositions felt very authentic, right? Which is like the experience of being a thinking being is like you're thinking about two things that feel really far apart in time and in experience, and like sometimes the it's hard to even see the tether that held them together. I was holding all four of the bits together in the end with a sense of the that EKG at the end, right? That there's this like deep sense of mortality and of a body that's fading, and
Yeah.
the idea that she's in the hospital getting this EKG on the day what I think it was the Pulitzer Prize they announced that she won that, and so to be like achieving this sort of huge thing at a moment you feel so like you're so vulnerable, and I was just thinking about like the memory of being a fidgety person that can't hold still in a life drawing class, right? And to be like gazing on these like naked models, thinking of, and so that bit, while it's not ever really articulated to me, felt like pretty closely tied to the that sort of being a body in the hospital. And then also that the forest felt like another way of sort of thinking about the particle and wave nature of we're here and then we're gone.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know, but I was definitely doing some work to get there. But it was work I enjoyed. I liked that, the way those gaps create a rupture, I had to think into.
Yeah.
Um, I want to double back to a question I had on my mind earlier about that Maxine Kumin essay, which we're so in the tank for poets writing essays. And one of the things that I thought was sort of funny about her essay, or I was like, it feels like cheating, but I don't care because I'm a poet too, is so many of her observations are in the essay are held together by her talking about a poem she's working on, right? Like she's like living with these horses, and she's like, all these horses are my aunts. And I'm working on a poem about how these horses are my aunts, right? Like and that was one of the things that was sort of holding the essay together. And so I was thinking a little bit about like why in the essay are we so sort of patient with essayists telling us about poems they're writing that may or may not ever come to be. And I think we are more patient than that. I can't think of very many essays or any essays where their essays are talking about the novel they're trying to write that they may or may not succeed in writing. Maybe it's just because I'm a poet and I'm not paying attention to the novelist essays writing essays. But I just don't think there's very many essays about failed novels, but lots of essays about poems in progress. And I was reminded of like Dorothy Wordsworth's journals, where she's often got these like incredibly detailed descriptions of walks she went on with her brother William that get distilled by William into these poems later. And I remember taking my 19th century lit class and learning that maybe he was plagiarizing her, or she was a co-author, and that's fun to think about. But I guess I was wondering if you all had thoughts about like the role poetry plays in the body of essays, like these, like poetry itself, like as a hypothetical thing, a poem that I'm working on that isn't actually in the essay, or I feel like there's also just like a lot of occasions where the writers slip into talking about poems, and we're cool with that too, right? Like, but it's not literary criticism; they're just like off on a tangent about poems. I was reading Edwidge Danticat's, who's a novelist, book of essays this morning, and she's got, I'm cheating here, you all haven't necessarily read those essays, but she's got tons of like riffs on poems that she loves, and like she's doing translations even of Haitian poets in there. Yeah, so yeah, why do we get to do this as poets? Why are we depriving the novelists of this same pleasure?
That's an interesting thought. I mean, I don't know if like when you're talking about the lyric essay as an in-between space, so you have the lyric, the poem that doesn't quite materialize or is sort of in process or hasn't been fully realized, but then mixed with the essay, which is in assay mode, so you're trying, attempting, um, that it feels like a permissive space to sort of trace your train of thought, in a way that might not solidify quite as much into a poem. I don't know. It seems like a couple of things that come to mind in that are, um, maybe it's the mushrooms too, that I've been thinking a lot about John Cage and how he would tie together, foraging and his own way of composing too, that a lot of it was indeterminacy and not being sure what you're going to find or what you're going to experience, but accepting all of it and using all of that with looking for mushrooms that you never know what you're going to find in a particular, foraging session. Um, Also makes me think somewhat of Marco Wilkerson's work too, that foraging as like a, um, as an aesthetic position, the same as John Cage, of foraging for your work so that you can try out certain things and, see what comes to you. And it might be something you can use in a poem, and it might not, and it might be another idea about your aunt, and trying these out. Um, and Lee might be able to speak more to this, but it also made me think in a way of Zuhitsu.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah,
jump
I
in
mean
real quick before we pass it to Lee and just say Marco Wilkinson's book is Matter if people want to like follow that train of thought to its total conclusion and read the book, Madder. And Heidi, is there a John Cage title that's on your mind specifically?
Oh, well, more thinking of like the mushroom book itself, which is like a very weird text, but, um and his indeterminacy, and where he's talking about mushroom foraging in particular, uh, and connecting that with his compositional practices.
he
Just
also
trying to
has
be
a
nice
book.
to all the people who aren't really talking to you all the time about John Cage and mushrooms, which is really a fun part of knowing you is getting to hit those topics regularly. Sorry,
John
Lee.
Cage also has a book called Silence, which he's sort of thinking
Yes.
about, once again, the randomness of composing, of listening, beyond the music, or listening and being aware that the silence isn't really silence, and that the and it's aleatoric or random, and kind of arrives by accident.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, yes, I think the Zuhitsu, like the running brush, that idea of sort of the spontaneous moment as it sort of presents itself to you, and the brush is running, to kind of keep up with the act of the experience, definitely makes sense along similar lines. And I what I love about the essay, sort of thinking through the making of the poem, is sort of the glimpse into process, the behind the scenes-ness nature of the poem, which, I think might be difficult to sustain within the frame of a poem, or most poems. Not impossible, but difficult, I think, to sustain. But also um the ways too, I love to kind of find out what people are foraging. Mushrooms, obviously, but also, what are they reading and what are they thinking about what they're reading. And, like Jenny Booley, who I think of as kind of a foundational lyric essayist, does that all the time, sort of thinking through the questions of what she's reading and what she's thinking about reading. And I think it's another kind of interiority, perhaps that is lyric in nature, but doesn't have maybe sort of the put togetherness of the Ars Poetica, which I as a reader, I'm sometimes very impatient with the Ars Poetica. When they're amazing, they're amazing, but sometimes it's just it can be too much, I think, when within the space of a poem.
Um, well, I feel like we've done a really good job bringing in lots of other essays in addition to the three Ploughshares essays. But I'm also so excited for your forthcoming Rose Medal Press Field Guide to the Lyric Essay, which I think will be carrying this tradition of poets' journals forward in new and interesting ways. So I wondered if you wanted to recommend one or two other writers from that project to sort of like wet people's whistles.
Well, I was particularly excited that one of my favorite writers, Kimiko Han, has contributed to the collection and sort of thinking about sort of her approaches to the Zuhitsu or running brush, which we were just talking about. And she's, of course, primarily known as a poet, yet she's working, I think, in this hybrid lyric essay form in really astonishingly wonderful ways. And then Julie Marie Wade, I think her book Fugue, an oral history in
Mm.
particular. She's writing about speculative essay, and as a poet, she's also always kind of making lyric moves. But I feel like Fugue, she's sort of thinking through her relationship to sound, but also like her own life history and its relation to sound, but then poetry as a kind of sound. And she mentions John Cage in that book, I believe, which
Yeah,
means
yeah.
I'm guaranteed to love it because she's mentioned John Cage. But she's also thinking about what it means to be a writer and a teacher of writing. And then also maybe Rajiv Mohabir, who's also a poet who is an incredible lyric essayist who I've taught. But his book, Anti-Man, who's thinking through questions of positionality, race, and identity, and also language in really interesting and deft ways.
Yeah, this was sort of a hard question. I was trying to think of
All of
which
them.
one.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of them too in terms of like the poet's journal, and
Yeah.
um I'm really excited about Sean Webster's work,
Yeah.
and he often posts on Facebook what he's reading with like images of the page that he's reading and his marginalia and what he's thinking about it, which to me seems sort of like the poet's journal. But he has a piece in the Rose Metal Press book that's talking about how his work is engaging with um, the archive and with archive theory, like Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharp and work like that. So how his work is quoting from and engaging with the archive. So I'm super excited for his forthcoming book, Without Terminus, that'll be out this summer. Um, and Diane Seuss's Frank Sonnets, of course. She's in there, and the idea of the sonnet as a like self-imposed container for memory to write this like memoir and flash lyric essays, um, almost as like a diary of her life, but in these little flash moments. And then Camille Dungy's piece on which talks about the braid, like setting up a braid, but is discussing her piece Painted Ladies. And one of the threads is a record of um, her family's life during the pandemic. So having that sort of dailiness of trying to fill those days and how they tried to hatch Painted Lady butterflies. And so checking on those every day too. But yeah, I'm really excited for us to show you that book when it's out.
Yes.
I'm more excited now for it than ever. And thank you both so much for this conversation about poets' journals and helping me sort of contextualize these Ploughshares pieces in really interesting ways.
Thank you so much for proposing this. These were really fun to think through.
Yeah, this was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.